Okay, so here's the thing about thinking you know everything at 25. You don't know a damn thing. My name is Eliza, and I suppose, if you want the unsanitized version, I systematically dismantled my entire life because I was bored. Because I thought my ideas were more sophisticated, more evolved than everyone else's. But even now, sitting in this cramped apartment that smells faintly of my roommate's burnt microwave popcorn, I can't bring myself to believe that what I did was entirely wrong. It was my idea, yes, but Liam agreed to it. Whatever happened after that was on both of us. It had to be. 2 years ago, I was living a life most people would kill for. I was with Liam, a man who, at 27, seemed to have his whole life mapped out with the precision of an architect's blueprint. We met through mutual friends at a backyard barbecue, one of those lazy Sunday afternoons that bleed into evening. He was cute in a quiet, unassuming way, with kind eyes and a smile that didn't feel like a performance. He had a decent job, something stable involving computers or accounting. I never really bothered to pin down the details. The point is, he made good money. I, on the other hand, was working part-time at a boutique clothing store downtown, a job where my biggest accomplishment was artfully folding sweaters that would be unartfully destroyed 2 minutes later. My paycheck barely covered my car payment and my penchant for overpriced lattes. Moving in together just made sense. It was a practical decision, a merger of financial convenience. His apartment was spacious and clean, with big windows that let in the afternoon light. He was always the one to buy groceries without a word, to pay for dinner on our dates without making some grand, uncomfortable gesture of it. He was stable, reliable, a safe harbor. The problem with safe harbors, I discovered, is that they are dreadfully still. The thing about Liam was his predictability. It was a comforting rhythm at first, then a metronome ticking away the seconds of my youth. Every single day, he would walk through the door at exactly 5:30 p.m. He'd kiss my forehead, his lips always a little chapped, and ask, "How was your day?" He'd listen, truly listen, to my meandering, pointless stories about rude customers and new dress shipments, nodding with an earnestness that started to feel like a performance of his own. Then he'd suggest we cook dinner together. Don't get me wrong, it was sweet. In the beginning, that sweetness was everything. He remembered I liked my coffee with a splash of oat milk and a whisper of cinnamon. He'd surprise me with a book by an author I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier. He didn't just hear the words I said, he absorbed them. But after a year, the routine began to feel less like a comfort and more like a cage. The sweet gestures became just another step in his daily programming. I'd watch him on Sunday mornings, diligently folding his laundry into perfect, crisp squares, or organizing his desk drawer for the third time that month, and a cold dread would wash over me. Is this it? Is this what the rest of my life is going to look like? He was perfectly content in our little bubble. He saw it as a world we had built. I saw it as the four walls of a beautifully decorated prison. Our life was a loop. We went to the same 3 restaurants, rotated through the same Netflix shows, and had the same conversations about his work friends, whose names and faces I could never be bothered to remember. I felt like I was fading, my colors turning muted and gray to match the placid landscape of our life. I was 25. I was supposed to be vibrant, chaotic, and alive. Instead, I felt like I was suffocating on contentment. The idea, the one that would become the catalyst for my life's implosion, came from my coworker, Phoebe. She was effortlessly cool, with a constellation of tiny tattoos up her arm and a way of speaking about her life as if it were a grand, romantic experiment. One afternoon, while steaming a rack of silk blouses, she told me about her open relationship with her boyfriend. "It was the best thing we ever did for our connection," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "It forces you to be honest. It makes you appreciate each other more because you're choosing to come home. The intimacy is better, and you get to grow as an individual." Her words planted a seed in the barren soil of my boredom. I went home and fell into an internet rabbit hole. I read articles about ethical non-monogamy, essays arguing that monogamy was a social construct, an outdated relic designed to control people. The more I read, the more the idea resonated, not as a solution, but as an undeniable truth I had been blind to. This is what Liam and I needed. We were young. We shouldn't be closing ourselves off from the world, from experience. How could I know if our love was truly exceptional if I had nothing to compare it to? What if there was someone out there who could excite me, challenge me, in ways Liam couldn't? The thought wasn't about leaving him. It was about enhancing us. I just wanted to see what I was missing. I wanted to gather experiences, like beautiful, exotic spices, and bring them back to the simple meal of our life together. I convinced myself it was the most loving, most generous thing I could do for our relationship. My campaign to convince Liam began subtly. I started dropping hints, weaving my newfound philosophy into our placid dinner conversations. I'd casually bring up an article I'd read about how evolved couples handle relationships, carefully choosing my words to frame it as a sign of ultimate security and trust. I'd talk about how tragically boring traditional relationships seemed, how people who were secure enough to let their partners explore were on a higher plane of emotional intelligence. Liam would just nod along, his focus on cutting his chicken into precise, even bites. He'd offer a non-committal or that's interesting, but he wouldn't engage. His passivity was infuriating. Here I was, trying to have a profound conversation about the very architecture of our future, and he was acting like I was discussing the weather. When I'd mention how some of our friends seemed so much more adventurous, he'd just shrug and say, "I'm happy with what we have." But I wasn't happy. I was dying inside. The routine, the predictability, it was a slow-acting poison. I needed something more, something that would jolt me back to life. And if Liam really loved me, truly loved me, wouldn't he want me to be fulfilled? Wouldn't he want me to be happy, even if the path to that happiness was unconventional? I started testing the waters more directly, framing it in hypotheticals. What would you do if I told you I wanted to see other people? I'd ask, trying to sound casual as we washed the dishes. He'd get this uncomfortable look, a slight furrow in his brow, and his hands would still in the soapy water. "I don't know, Eliza. Why would you want to?" he'd say, before changing the subject to something safe, like whether we needed to buy more olive oil. His avoidance only proved my point. He was being possessive, insecure. If you really trust someone, why would the idea of them exploring other connections be a threat? I wasn't talking about falling in love with someone else. I was talking about having new experiences that would, ultimately, make our relationship stronger. I felt him holding me back, tethering my potential to his traditional, unimaginative worldview. My resentment began to build. I felt that I was trying to grow, to evolve, while he was content to stay stagnant, clinging to an antiquated idea that love meant ownership. The staleness in our relationship, I decided, wasn't just the routine, it was his refusal to be challenged. I resolved to be more direct. The final push took 3 weeks of concentrated effort. I was relentless. I left articles about the benefits of ethical non-monogamy open on his laptop. I bookmarked stories about couples who claimed their bond had been strengthened through exploration. I'd greet him at the door with anecdotes about a celebrity couple or a podcast host who championed the lifestyle. To his credit, he read everything I showed him, but his enthusiasm never matched mine. He'd ask cautious, negative questions. But doesn't this usually end badly? Or, what if one person gets more attached than the other? That only happens when people aren't mature enough to handle it, I'd counter, my voice laced with the condescending patience of a teacher explaining a simple concept. It happens when they let jealousy and insecurity take over instead of communicating openly. I started pointing out the flaws in our own relationship with surgical precision. We haven't had a truly passionate night in months, I'd say, watching his face fall. We barely even flirt anymore. We're more like roommates than lovers. I'd tell him that maybe, just maybe, if we both had other experiences to draw from, we'd bring that excitement back to each other. He just looked sad when I said things like that, which only frustrated me more. His sadness felt like a weakness, a refusal to see the brilliant solution I was offering. I weaponized Phoebe's story, describing how she and her boyfriend, after 4 years together, were stronger than ever. How they dated other people but always came home to each other, their connection renewed and electrified. Liam's next question was quiet, but it hit a nerve. "Do you already have someone in mind?" I got defensive, instantly. "This isn't about a specific person," I snapped. "This is about us. It's about growing together, instead of getting stagnant." But it was a lie, or at least a half-truth. There was a guy, Marcus, a barista at the coffee shop next to my work, who flirted with me relentlessly. And another guy from my gym who kept asking me to get drinks. I hadn't acted on anything, but I was keenly aware of the attention, a warm little glow of validation that I craved. When he'd voice his concerns, I'd flip them back on him. Why are you so threatened? Do you think I'd leave you the second someone else showed interest? That says more about your insecurities than it does about my intentions. I told him I loved him, and that's why I wanted to do this with honesty, instead of cheating or breaking up. I framed it as the ultimate act of respect for our relationship. I began to withhold affection. It wasn't entirely conscious, but when he'd shut down the conversation, I'd feel a chasm open between us, and I'd pull away. Then, when he seemed more open to discussing it, I'd be extra loving, attentive, and passionate. I wanted him to see the difference. I wanted him to associate openness with my love and resistance with my distance. The breakthrough, the final crack in his resolve, came one evening as we sat on the balcony. I let my voice break, infusing it with a desperate vulnerability I knew he couldn't ignore. I feel trapped, I whispered. Not by you, by the whole idea of this. I'm 25, Liam. I've only ever seriously dated 3 people. How am I supposed to know if what we have is really special if I have nothing to compare it to? I reached for his hand. I'm not asking to leave you. I'm asking for us to explore together so we can choose each other every day instead of just staying together out of habit. He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights. Finally, he said he'd think about it. It was the first real sign of progress. A few days later, he came back with his condition. It seemed a little dramatic at the time. Okay, he said, his voice heavy. We can try this, but I have one rule, for me. If I find myself developing real, genuine feelings for someone else during this experiment, I have to end our relationship. I won't string you along or cheat emotionally. I thought it was extreme. The whole point was that our connection was special, that it wouldn't be threatened by casual encounters. But I agreed instantly, a triumphant relief washing over me. I knew it wouldn't be an issue. Liam had been with me for 2 years. He wasn't going to throw that away for a random hookup. Besides, I was the one pushing for this. I was the one ready to explore. He'd probably be too nervous or picky to even find anyone worth a first date. When he finally said yes, the world seemed to shift into vibrant color. Finally, we were going to break out of our rut. We were going to live. The moment Liam gave his reluctant consent, a jolt of pure, unadulterated excitement shot through me. It felt like the first day of summer vacation after a long, dreary school year. While he seemed to retreat into a shell of quiet sadness, which I dismissed as him just needing time to adjust to our new, more enlightened normal, I sprang into action. I immediately updated the dating profiles I'd secretly created weeks earlier, polishing my bio until it shone with the promise of casual, no-strings fun. I sent a breezy text to Marcus from the coffee shop and another to the guy from my gym. Within a week, I had 3 different dates lined up. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in months. The anticipation, the ritual of getting ready, the thrill of witty, flirtatious banter with someone new, it was intoxicating. I was myself again, not just Liam's boring, predictable girlfriend. He asked if we should set any ground rules, like not bringing people back to the apartment or a veto power on partners. I waved it off. Let's not complicate things, I said. We trust each other. That should be enough. In reality, I didn't want any rules that might restrict my freedom. I barely paid attention to what Liam was doing in those first few weeks. I was too consumed by my own whirlwind of experiences, finally feeling desired and interesting again. This, I thought, was exactly what our relationship needed, a dose of external validation to remind us why we chose each other in the first place. But after 3 months, the glittering facade of my new life was starting to crack. The dates were fun, for a while. Marcus, the hot barista, turned out to be incredibly shallow. Our entire conversation revolved around his gym routine and the precise macros in his protein shakes. The guy from the gym was decent enough, but he was clearly just looking for a physical connection with 0 emotional depth. It was a frustrating paradox. I wanted the excitement of a new relationship, but I also wanted the depth and security I had with Liam. These other guys didn't know my favorite coffee order. They didn't remember the story I'd told them last week about a funny customer at the store. They didn't care if I had a bad day or notice when I got a haircut. The validation was nice, a quick sugar rush for my ego, but it felt empty and transient compared to the steady, nourishing meal of Liam's affection that I had taken for granted. Meanwhile, a strange and unsettling transformation was happening with Liam. He seemed different, happier, somehow, more confident. He carried himself with a new lightness. He'd started going out more, joining a weekend hiking group and taking a photography class on Tuesday nights. When I'd ask about his dating life, he'd just smile and say, "It's going well," before deftly changing the subject. Part of me was annoyed that he wasn't sharing details like I was, but I was too wrapped up in my own drama to push it. The thing that really started to bother me was how unavailable he'd become. He used to be my constant, my always free for me person. Now, he had plans I didn't know about. He'd get texts during dinner and smile at his phone in a private, intimate way that made my stomach twist into a tight knot. When I'd ask who he was talking to, he'd just say, "A friend," and put his phone away. Jealousy, an emotion I had deemed beneath my evolved sensibilities, began to creep in. It was stupid. This whole thing was my idea. But my plan had a fatal flaw. It was predicated on the assumption that I would be the one thriving while Liam floundered. He'd always been a bit shy and awkward when we first met. I had imagined he'd go on a few boring, awkward dates and come running back, more appreciative of me than ever. Instead, the opposite was happening. My own dating life was becoming more desperate. I was going out with men I wasn't even attracted to, just to have something to do, just to feel like I was still participating in the experiment I had championed. I was chasing the butterfly feeling I craved, but everyone felt like a cheap imitation, a downgrade from Liam, which, of course, wasn't the point of this at all. The point was to find something he couldn't give me, not to be constantly reminded of how good he actually was. He seemed to be flourishing in ways that made me deeply uncomfortable. The quiet, predictable man I had wanted to escape was now a man with his own secrets, his own life that didn't revolve around me. And I hated it. The dynamic between us had completely inverted. I was the one feeling insecure, the one picking fights over stupid things just to get a reaction, to feel like I still held a central place in his emotional world. I'd snap at him for being on his phone, for seeming distracted when we spent our dwindling time together. I accused him of not putting effort into our relationship anymore. He'd just look at me with a calm, almost pitying expression. "Eliza, this is what you wanted," he'd remind me gently. "You wanted us to explore other connections. But I'm not neglecting us." I'd argue, my voice rising. "I still try to plan things. You're the one who's never available." It was true. When I'd try to plan a date night or a weekend trip, he'd often have other commitments. "I have plans with my hiking group," or "I'm going to a gallery opening with a friend from my class." I felt like I was competing for time with my own boyfriend, a concept so absurd it made my head spin. These other people were supposed to be extras, side characters. They were not supposed to become main characters in his life. A dark suspicion began to fester in my mind. Was he following our unspoken rules? Was he getting too emotionally involved with someone? The whole point was to keep these other connections light and fun, not to find a replacement. But his behavior suggested something more serious. He seemed to be taking this arrangement far more seriously than I had ever intended. The worst part was his emotional withdrawal. He had always been my sounding board, the person I'd vent to after a bad day. Now, when I'd complain about my disappointing dates or want to analyze what some guy meant by a cryptic text, he'd just nod and make non-committal sounds. "That sucks," he'd say, his eyes distant. He no longer cared about the minutiae of my life. He was no longer my anchor. I began to suspect he was seeing someone specific, not just casually dating like I was. The patterns were too consistent, being unavailable on the same nights, getting texts that made him smile in that specific, tender way. When I'd hint around, trying to get details, he'd shut me down politely but firmly. "I'm respecting her privacy, just like I respect yours," he'd say. But I wasn't being secretive. I told him about everyone I went out with, sharing the funny stories and the frustrating moments. I thought we were supposed to be navigating this experience together, openly. His protectiveness felt like a betrayal. It felt sneaky. The discovery that shattered my carefully constructed reality happened on a random Tuesday. I was scrolling through Instagram during my lunch break, a mindless habit to numb the boredom. And then I saw it. Liam, tagged in a photo at a new restaurant downtown. He was smiling, a wide, genuine, unreservedly happy smile that I hadn't seen on his face in months. He wasn't alone. Next to him was a woman. Her name was Audrey. She was beautiful, but not in an intimidating way. She looked happy and comfortable, her head tilted slightly towards his, a gesture of easy intimacy. This wasn't a first date. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked on her profile. It was public. I fell down a rabbit hole of obsessive scrolling. There were multiple photos of them together going back weeks. At an art gallery, on a hiking trail with sweeping views, even one that looked like a weekend trip to a cozy cabin in the woods. They looked like a real couple. They were holding hands. He had his arm around her. They were looking at each other with an understanding that spoke of shared jokes and whispered secrets. It was everything I had been chasing with those other men, and they had found it, effortlessly. Audrey seemed so different from me. She was a few years older, maybe 28 or 29, and she exuded a quiet confidence that came through even in pixels. She posted about books she was reading, volunteer work she was doing at an animal shelter, solo trips she'd taken to Southeast Asia. She seemed so whole, so complete, so utterly put together in a way that made me feel juvenile and scattered. In every photo, Liam looked relaxed and genuinely joyful. Not the polite, placid happiness he'd shown me lately, but real, vibrant joy. He looked like the man I first fell in love with, only better. More himself. That night, I confronted him, my voice shaking with a rage born of pure terror. I held up my phone, the picture of him and Audrey glowing between us like a piece of radioactive evidence. "Who is she?" I demanded. "Why didn't you tell me you were seeing someone seriously?" He looked at the phone, then back at me, his expression calm and steady. "Her name is Audrey," he said, his voice even. "And you never asked for details." I was respecting the boundaries of our arrangement. "This isn't just dating, Liam. This looks like a relationship," I cried. "We need to stop this. This whole experiment. It's over. I want to go back to just us." He got quiet then, a deep, unnerving stillness that scared me more than any shouting match could have. He didn't immediately agree. He didn't look relieved. He looked conflicted. "I need to think about it," he said. That wasn't the answer I was expecting, and in that moment I knew I had already lost. He didn't make me wait long. The next evening, he sat me down on the sofa, the same sofa where I had first pitched my brilliant, life-altering idea. He didn't look angry or defensive. He just looked profoundly sad, and that was so much worse. "Eliza," he began, his voice low and steady, "I have developed real feelings for her." The words hung in the air, clinical and precise. He was invoking the clause, his one condition, the one I had so arrogantly dismissed. "And," he continued, taking a breath that seemed to pain him, "according to the boundary I set months ago, the one we both agreed on, that means I have to end our relationship." The floor fell out from under me. I stared at him, unable to process it. "No," I whispered. "You can't be serious. You can't choose some woman you've known for 3 months over me. Over us. We have 2 years of history." "This isn't about choosing her over you in that way," he said, shaking his head. "This is about honoring the promise I made to you and to myself. I told you I wouldn't string you along. Being with you while being in love with someone else, that would be a lie. And our relationship, whatever it's become, doesn't deserve that." Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I tried everything. I cried, hot, messy tears of disbelief and rage. I reminded him of our first trip together, of the inside jokes we shared, of all the good times we'd had before I'd ruined everything. I got angry, accusing him of using my idea as an excuse to leave. "I promise I'll be different," I begged, the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. "I'll be more appreciative. I won't be bored. I don't need to explore anymore. I just need you." He just watched me, his expression filled with a deep, sorrowful finality. It was like he had already made his decision days ago, and my frantic performance was just a painful epilogue he had to endure. Nothing I said mattered. He had moved on. He had evolved, just as I'd wanted him to, but he had evolved away from me. He started packing his things that weekend. The sound of his movements in the other room, the soft thud of books being placed in a box, the rustle of clothes being taken from drawers, The squeak of packing tape being pulled from its roll became the soundtrack to my world ending. Watching him fold his shirts into those same perfect, neat squares that I used to resent felt surreal. This was actually happening. He was leaving me. He was leaving me for someone else. Someone I had practically gift-wrapped and handed to him. The cruelest part was that he didn't seem to be leaving in anger. There was an undercurrent of excitement about his future with Audrey. It wasn't malicious. It was genuine. He spoke about her with a quiet reverence that he used to reserve for me. He had found someone who gave him the sense of adventure he didn't know he was missing, without any of the drama and insecurity I had created. After 2 years of me trying to improve our relationship, to make it more exciting, he'd found someone who gave him everything he needed just by being herself. When he was finally ready to go, his boxes stacked by the door, he turned to me. "I do love you, Eliza," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "Or at least, I love the person you were and the life we had. But you didn't want that life, and maybe this is for the best. You pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I found something wonderful. I hope you find what you're looking for, too." He hugged me, a brief, sterile embrace that felt like hugging a stranger. Then he picked up his boxes and walked out the door. The final click of the lock echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the apartment. I stood there for a long time, surrounded by the empty spaces where his things used to be, alone with the catastrophic consequences of my grand experiment. I had wanted to know if what we had was special. I had my answer. It was, and I had destroyed it. 6 months later, my life had completely unraveled. Without Liam's income, I couldn't afford our apartment, that beautiful, sun-drenched space I had once called a prison. I had to move into a cramped 2-bedroom with a couple of roommates who were basically strangers, found through a frantic post on a housing website. The independence I thought I craved now felt like crushing isolation. I'd come home from my retail job to the smell of someone else's cooking and the sound of a television show I didn't recognize. There was no one to ask about my day. No one who remembered my favorite takeout order. My dating life, the very thing that was supposed to liberate me, became a series of bleak, disappointing encounters. Word had gotten around our mutual friend group about what happened, and a reputation had formed around me. Guys seemed to think I was either easy and up for anything, or emotionally unstable. The ones who showed interest weren't looking for anything serious, and the few who were usually the kind of men I would have never looked at twice before. The thrill was gone, replaced by a gnawing desperation. I developed a toxic, obsessive habit, checking Liam and Audrey's social media profiles. It was a form of self-torture I couldn't resist. I watched their perfect relationship unfold in a curated stream of happiness. Weekend trips to the coast. Photos of them meeting each other's families. Everyone beaming. Posts from art museums and hiking trails. Audrey would tag him in photos of books they were reading together or concerts they'd attended. Everything about them looked so effortless, so genuine, in a way that made my relationship with him seem forced and desperate by comparison. The breaking point, the moment I truly lost my grip, came when I decided to reach out to Audrey directly. In a haze of wine and self-pity, I crafted a long, rambling message, convincing myself I was doing her a favor. I warned her about Liam's true nature. I painted him as a man with commitment issues who had emotionally cheated on me, someone who had strung me along while pursuing her. I thought that maybe, if I could just plant a seed of doubt, their perfect world would crumble. Instead of being grateful, Audrey did something I never anticipated. She took screenshots of our entire conversation and shared them with a few of our mutual acquaintances. Suddenly, everyone could see, in black and white, exactly how unhinged I'd become. They saw the proof of my stalking, my jealousy, and my pathetic attempts to break them up with lies. My reputation went from being the girl who made a mistake to the crazy ex who can't move on. Work became impossible. I was constantly distracted, my mind replaying my failures on a loop. I'd snap at customers or coworkers, my grief and anger spilling out at the slightest provocation. My manager finally had to let me go, gently explaining that I was no longer a good fit for a customer-facing role. Between losing Liam's financial support and then my own income, I was completely screwed. The few friends who still spoke to me grew tired of my bitterness. They'd listen for a while, but their eyes would glaze over as I rehashed the same story, the same justifications, the same complaints. Eventually, they'd change the subject or make excuses to end the conversation. I had neglected most of my friendships during my time with Liam, and now when I needed them most, I realized I had nothing left to draw on. The final, definitive blow came when I found out, again through social media, that Liam had proposed to Audrey. He had asked her to marry him at the same Italian restaurant where he had first told me he loved me 2 years earlier. The photos were radiant. They were surrounded by friends and family, their faces alight with pure joy. Her ring was beautiful, an elegant, vintage piece that was so perfectly her, not me. It was clear he had put immense thought into it. I realized then, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that in less than a year, Audrey had gotten everything I had ever wanted from him: his full attention, his emotional investment, his unwavering commitment to a future. And she hadn't had to beg, or manipulate, or threaten to get it. He had given it to her freely, joyfully, because she was the kind of person who inspired that level of devotion. Even after all of this, a stubborn, defensive part of me still insists I wasn't completely wrong. How are you supposed to know if what you have is real without comparison? Liam agreed to the arrangement. Whatever happened was his responsibility too. If he had really loved me, he wouldn't have been able to fall for someone else so easily, so quickly. The fact that he moved on proves that what we had wasn't as strong as I thought. Now I'm living in a different city, trying to start over. But it's hard to meet people when you're 26, and your past is a wreckage you're still crawling out of. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd just been content. If I had appreciated the quiet, steady love I had. But then I remember how suffocated I felt, and I know I would have ended up resenting him eventually anyway. The whole experience taught me that you can't force someone to want the same things you want. But it also taught me that some people aren't capable of handling complex relationship dynamics. Maybe Liam was just too simple, too traditional, to appreciate the beautiful, intricate thing I was trying to build for us. I still think about them sometimes, wondering if she will eventually get bored the way I did. But mostly, I try to focus on my own future, on finding someone who can finally match my energy. People tell me I need to take responsibility for what happened. But honestly, I tried to make our relationship better. He was the one who chose to throw it all away. And that says more about his character than it does about mine, doesn't it?